Betrayal stings deepest when it comes from your own kin. Thrown into a freezing wooden cart, 19-year-old Mave Hastings was traded like cattle to a beast of legend to pay her father's debts. But what her family never realized was that the monster wasn't a monster at all. History books of the 14th century will tell you that the deep forests of the northern reaches were uninhabitable, plagued by wolves the size of draft horses and harsh, unforgiving winters. But local lore from the village of Oakhaven whispered of something else, the Lichen Kings. Specifically Alpha King Desmond Vane, a towering warlord rumored to tear men in half with his bare hands. For generations, a treaty had kept the beasts in the woods and the humans in their villages. But treaties are fragile things, especially when greed is involved. Enter Bartholomew Hastings. He was a wealthy silk and spice merchant, a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his actual business acumen. By the harsh winter of 1342, Bartholomew had gambled away the family fortune. To appease the ruthless debt collectors of the Iron Guild, he needed safe passage through the northern reaches to smuggle untaxed goods. But Desmond Vane controlled the woods, and Desmond Vane demanded a heavy toll. Bartholomew didn't have gold, but he did have 2 daughters. His youngest, Rosalind, was the golden child, pampered, beautiful, and betrothed to a wealthy lord. Then there was Mave. Mave was the eldest, the pragmatic one, who ran the estate's ledgers, managed the servants, and kept the family afloat, while her father drank their profits. She was indispensable, but to Bartholomew, she was completely expendable. On the eve of her 19th birthday, Mave was drugged with poppy wine. When she awoke, her wrists were bound with coarse rope, and she was shivering in the back of a slatted iron wagon. "You must understand, my dear." Her father's voice had drifted through the freezing wind as the horses pulled away. "The Alpha King demanded a sacrifice for our safe passage. You are saving your sister. You are saving our legacy." She watched in numb horror as her father and sister stood on the manor steps. Rosalind wasn't weeping. She was wearing Mave's own winter cloak. The journey into the mountains was a death march. Mave was escorted by 3 terrified mercenaries who refused to look her in the eye. They drove the wagon deep into the pine forests, where the snow grew thick and the shadows stretched long. Howls echoed through the valleys, not the yips of ordinary wolves, but deep, chest-rattling roars that made the horses foam at the mouth with panic. When they finally arrived at Castle Morvin, it was nothing like the ruined cave of a beast that Mave had imagined. It was a sprawling, ancient citadel of black stone, jutting out of the cliffside like a jagged crown. The mercenaries practically threw her onto the snowy courtyard, shoved a sealed parchment into her frozen hands, and fled into the night, leaving the gates to slam shut behind her. Mave stood alone in the freezing cold, waiting for a monster to emerge and tear out her throat. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the keep opened. Out strode a man. He was staggeringly tall, easily 6'5", with shoulders broad enough to block out the torchlight. He wore a heavy fur mantle over boiled leather armor. His face was all sharp angles and rough scars framing piercing, unnatural amber eyes that glowed in the dark. This was Alpha King Desmond Vane. He didn't snarl. He didn't lunge. He simply stared down at the shivering, blue-lipped girl clutching a crumpled letter. "What is this?" Desmond's voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the stones beneath Mave's feet. I am the tribute." Mave stammered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "From Bartholomew Hastings. For the toll." Desmond stepped closer. The sheer heat radiating off his body was immense, a physical wave of warmth in the sub-zero air. He snatched the letter from her hand, broke the wax seal, and read it. As his amber eyes scanned the page, his jaw clenched, and a low, terrifying growl actually vibrated from his chest. "A tribute," he repeated, his voice laced with pure disgust. He crumpled the parchment in his massive fist. "I asked your father for a diplomat, an emissary to negotiate the border lines. He sends me his own daughter as what a piece of meat to appease a bedtime story." Mave blinked through the snow, catching on her eyelashes. You don't eat humans?" Desmond looked down at her, his expression shifting from rage to a weary, cynical amusement. "Only the ones who ask stupid questions. Come inside before you freeze to death, little bird. I have no use for a corpse." Mave expected a dungeon. Instead, she was given a sprawling chamber with a roaring hearth velvet tapestries and a feather bed. For the first few weeks, she was essentially a ghost in Castle Morvin. She learned quickly that the monsters of the northern reaches were simply a hidden society of lichens. They walked on two legs, spoke eloquently, forged their own steel, and only allowed their beasts to surface during the full moon or in the heat of battle. They were fiercely loyal to one another, operating as a massive synchronized family. And Desmond ruled them all with an iron fist and a surprisingly fair mind. Mave watched him from the shadows of the courtyard balconies. She watched him spar with his beta, a scarred warrior named Finnick. She watched him hold council with the village elders, distributing winter rations to ensure no pup went hungry. He was a terrifying warlord, yes, but he was also a fiercely protective king. Boredom and her natural inclination for management soon took over. Mave couldn't just sit in her room waiting for her father to remember her. She began visiting the castle kitchens, helping the overworked head housekeeper, a gruff lichen woman named Marta. Mave reorganized their chaotic root cellars, balanced their winter rationing ledgers, and used her knowledge of herbalism to brew poultices for the guards injured in border skirmishes. The pack, initially suspicious of the human girl, began to warm to her. They had expected a weeping, fragile noblewoman. Instead, they got a girl who would roll up her sleeves, curse out a stubborn draft horse, and scrub blood off the cobblestones without batting an eye. Desmond noticed. The tension between them was a slow burning ember. They would cross paths in the candlelit corridors, and the air would suddenly feel too thick to breathe. Desmond would stop his amber eyes, tracking her every movement, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if committing her scent to memory. One evening he cornered her in the library. Mave was reaching for a heavy tome on crop rotation when Desmond's massive hand reached over her shoulder, easily plucking it from the top shelf. His chest brushed against her back, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "You aren't what I expected, Mave Hastings," he murmured, his voice a dark velvet hum right by her ear. "What did you expect, Your Grace?" she challenged, turning to face him. She was trapped between the bookshelf and his massive frame, but she refused to drop her gaze. "A spoiled merchant's daughter crying for her finery," he said, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. "Not a woman who reprimands my quartermaster for his sloppy math and spends her afternoons brewing willow bark tea for my soldiers. I like to be useful. You belong to me now," he stated, the possessive edge in his voice causing her breath to hitch. "Not as a sacrifice, but as my ward. When the spring thaw comes, I will send you wherever you wish to go with enough gold to start anew. But until then, you stay in my sights." It was a promise of freedom, but for some reason, the thought of leaving Castle Morvin made Mave's chest ache. She was beginning to realize the true monsters weren't the ones howling in the woods. They were the ones wearing velvet doublets in the city. But Bartholomew Hastings wasn't finished with her. The turning point came during the first blizzard of January. Mave had brought a wooden chest of her meager belongings from Oakhaven, including a heavy, ornate silver locket her father had insisted she wear for protection. One morning, Finnick Desmond's towering beta collapsed in the great hall. His veins turned a sickly, bruised purple, and he began violently seizing, coughing up black blood. Panic erupted. Lycans were incredibly resilient. They didn't just fall ill. Desmond was frantic, roaring for the healers. But as the castle medic ripped open Finnick's tunic, Mave recognized the sickly, bitter scent wafting off the beta's skin. It was a smell she had noticed faintly lingering around her own room for weeks. Wolfsbane, refined, concentrated, and lethal. Desmond's golden eyes snapped toward Mave, his pupils dilating into thin, feral slits. In an instant, the protective king vanished, replaced by the predator of legend. He crossed the room in a blur of motion, slamming Mave against the stone wall. His forearm pressed against her collarbone, nearly crushing her breath away. "What did you bring into my home?" He snarled his canines, visibly lengthening. "Nothing," Mave gasped, terrified tears springing to her eyes. "Desmond, I swear I don't. He was stationed outside your door last night." Desmond roared, the sound rattling the iron chandeliers. "He breathed in whatever poison you were harboring. You were a Trojan horse." Maeve's mind raced. She thought of her belongings, the dresses, the books, the locket. "Wear it always, my dear." For protection, her father had smiled, locking the clasp around her neck before pushing her into the cart. "My necklace," she choked out, clawing at her collar. "The silver locket." Desmond ripped the heavy silver pendant from her neck, breaking to the chain. He didn't even bother to open the clasp. He crushed the metal in his bare fist. As the silver shattered, a cloud of fine grey powder cascaded onto the floor, hissing as it hit the stone. The stench of concentrated wolfsbane filled the air. But that wasn't all. Amidst the powder was a small, pulsing crimson stone, a blood magic tracker. Desmond dropped the crushed metal, his expression morphing from rage to absolute horror. He looked from the tracker to Mave, who was sliding down the wall, weeping in shock and betrayal. Her family hadn't just sold her to die. They had turned her into a walking biological weapon. Bartholomew had made a secondary deal with the human armies of Lord Alistair in the south. He sent Mave to weaken the Lycan King's inner circle with airborne wolfsbane and provided a tracking stone so Alistair's army could find the hidden fortress of Castle Morvin in the dead of winter. "They used me," Mave whispered, clutching her chest, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "My own father. He made me a bomb." Desmond stared at the broken, sobbing girl on his floor. The feral anger drained from his eyes, replaced by a profound, agonizing understanding. She was a victim, just as much as his pack was. He knelt before her, entirely ignoring the toxic powder dusting his boots. He reached out his massive, calloused hands, gently cupping her tear-streaked face. "They sent a lamb to slaughter my wolves," Desmond said softly, his thumbs wiping away her tears. His voice was no longer a warlord's roar, but a deep, solemn vow. "But they underestimated what happens when a lamb decides she's had enough of the shepherd. Rise, Mave. They are coming for us, and we are going to make them bleed." The revelation hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Mave had been sent to her death, but her father's treachery had unwittingly given the Lycans their greatest strategic advantage, her mind. As Desmond rallied his generals, the courtyard was a frenzy of snarling beasts and the clanging of heavy iron. The tracker had been crushed, but its pulse had already given Lord Alistair the coordinates of the hidden valley. They had hours, perhaps less, before an army of human mercenaries, armed to the teeth with silver and wolfsbane, breached the mountain pass. Inside the war room, Desmond's commanders mapped out a desperate defense. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, and the airborne poison had already sickened several of their best fighters. "They will bring siege towers." Finnick coughed, his skin still terribly pale, though Mave's rapid administration of a charcoal and milk thistle draught had stabilized him. "They will try to breach the southern gate. We hold the choke point." "No." Mave's voice sliced through the heavy testosterone-filled air of the war room. A dozen massive scarred lichen warlords turned to stare at the fragile human girl standing by the hearth. Desmond, however, did not glare. He simply crossed his massive arms and nodded. "Speak, Mave." "My father financed Lord Alistair's campaign," she said, stepping up to the heavy oak map table. "I balanced the ledgers. I know exactly what he bought. They don't have siege towers. The mountain passes are too narrow to transport timber of that size. They bought black powder. Hundreds of barrels of it. They aren't going to climb your walls, Desmond. They're going to blow the southern gate to ash." A stunned silence fell over the room. If the lichens had massed their forces at the gate to repel a physical breach, the explosion would have wiped out their entire vanguard in a single devastating blast. Desmond's amber eyes locked onto hers, burning with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. "What is our counter-move, little bird? We let them inside," Mave said, her voice turning remarkably cold. "We open the southern gate ourselves." The plan was a masterpiece of lethal deception. Under Mave's direction, Marta and the castle staff hastily rigged the courtyard with heavy vats of rendered animal fat and pitch from the kitchens, burying them beneath the thick snow. Mave utilized the remaining crushed silver and wolfsbane from her locket, mixing it with black powder from the armory, to create smoke bombs that would burn the human soldiers' eyes without carrying the lethal airborne particles to the lichens. By midnight, the storm outside raged, and the war horns of Lord Alistair's army shattered the silence. Thousands of torches flickered through the pine trees like a river of fire. The human army marched with arrogant confidence, dragging heavy iron cannons through the slush, fully expecting a fortress weakened by poison and caught off guard. When they reached the southern gate, they found it eerily cracked open. Suspecting a trap, Alistair sent his vanguard in first. Hundreds of heavily armored mercenaries poured into the darkened, snow-covered courtyard. It was dead silent. Then, high above on the battlements, a single flaming arrow cut through the blizzard. It was fired by Mave. The arrow struck the snowbank in the center of the courtyard. The hidden pitch ignited instantly. A wall of fire roared to life, trapping the vanguard inside and cutting them off from the rest of the army. Now! Desmond's roar shook the very foundations of the castle. From the shadows the lichens descended. They did not fight as men. They shifted. Massive, terrifying beasts the size of draft horses, covered in thick fur and muscle, slammed into the human ranks. Desmond led the charge, his wolf form an absolute nightmare of midnight black fur and glowing golden eyes. He tore through steel armor as if it were parchment, a whirlwind of claws and teeth that utterly decimated the front lines. The battle was chaotic and bloody. Mave stood on the balcony, coordinating the archers and dropping her alchemical smoke bombs onto the human cannons outside the walls, rendering their black powder wet and useless. But Lord Alistair was no fool. Realizing the courtyard was a death trap, he signaled his elite archers to focus entirely on the massive black wolf leading the pack. Thwack! A silver bolt dripping with concentrated wolfsbane caught Desmond in the shoulder. The Alpha King let out an earth-shattering roar of pain and stumbled, reverting back to his human form as the poison instantly shocked his nervous system. 3 heavily armored human knights saw their chance and charged the fallen king, raising their broadswords to claim the ultimate bounty. Mave didn't think. She acted. Snatching a heavy crossbow from a fallen guard, she sprinted down the icy stone steps, her skirts flying behind her. She hit the courtyard level just as the knights raised their blades. "Get away from him!" Mave screamed. She leveled the heavy crossbow and fired. The bolt punched cleanly through the neck of the lead knight. As the other two turned toward her in shock, Finnick and the recovering vanguard crashed into them, tearing them away from their alpha. Mave dropped the crossbow and slid across the bloody snow, throwing herself to her knees beside Desmond. His breathing was ragged, his skin burning with unnatural fever where the silver bolt remained lodged in his flesh. "You foolish girl." Desmond choked out coughing black blood as he looked up at her. "You should be in the keep." "Shut up!" She snapped her hands, trembling as she gripped the shaft of the bolt. "I manage the assets of this castle, and I refuse to let my king die on my watch. Brace yourself!" With a vicious yank, she pulled the silver bolt from his shoulder. Desmond roared, his body arching in agony. Mave immediately pressed a handful of crushed charcoal and yarrow straight into the wound to draw out the poison, binding it tightly with strips torn from her own dress. The loss of their vanguard and the destruction of their cannons broke the human army's spirit. As the remaining Lycans pushed out of the gates, Lord Alistair's forces broke and fled into the freezing woods, where the winter cold would finish what the wolves had started. They had won. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the smoke and the dead, Desmond slowly pushed himself up. He looked at Mave, her hands covered in his blood, her face smudged with ash, breathing heavily but standing her ground. He didn't see a fragile merchant's daughter. He saw a queen. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, the towering warlord reached out, pulled Mave against his chest and crashed his lips down onto hers. It was a kiss of fire and blood born of adrenaline and absolute, undeniable possession. Mave gasped against his mouth, but her hands flew to his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the beast she had saved. When they finally broke apart, Desmond rested his forehead against hers, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering vow. "No more running," he growled softly. "No more hiding in the shadows. You are mine, Mave Hastings, my mate, my Luna. And when the snow melts, we are going south. We have a debt to collect." Spring arrived in the southern valleys with a burst of color and a false sense of security. In the wealthy trading city of Oakhaven, Bartholomew Hastings was at the pinnacle of his success, with the tragic loss of his eldest daughter supposedly buying him political favor, and the war in the north assumed to be a mutual destruction. He had amassed unprecedented wealth. Tonight was the crown jewel of his ambition, the wedding gala of his golden child Rosalind to Duke Harrington. The Hastings manor was completely transformed. Silk banners hung from the chandeliers, crystal glasses clinked, and the elite of the kingdom danced to the music of a grand orchestra. Bartholomew stood at the top of the grand staircase, beaming as he raised a golden goblet to toast the newlyweds. "To my beautiful daughter Rosalind." Bartholomew projected his voice, echoing through the opulent hall. "And to the enduring legacy of the Hastings family, a legacy built on sacrifice, duty, and triumph. A legacy built on blood and cowardice, you mean." The voice did not shout, but it carried a cold, cutting authority that silenced the orchestra instantly. The heavy, reinforced mahogany doors of the manor did not just open. They were kicked off their iron hinges, crashing onto the marble floor with a deafening boom. The wealthy elite gasped, backing away in sheer terror as a terrifying contingent of massive leather-clad warriors strode into the hall. Their eyes glowed in the low light. These were not mere mercenaries. These were predators. And walking flawlessly through the center of their ranks was Mave. She was utterly unrecognizable from the shivering, unwanted girl they had thrown into a cart 6 months prior. Mave wore a gown of deep crimson velvet and black wolf fur, tailored to accentuate an aura of absolute command. Around her neck rested a heavy collar of pure forged iron, the mark of a Luna. Beside her walked Desmond Vane, his massive frame towering over the southern nobles, his hand resting possessively on the hilt of a broadsword. "Mave," Bartholomew whispered, his golden goblet slipping from his hand and clattering against the marble stairs, all the blood drained from his face. "But you were a tribute. You were dead. I was a sacrifice," Mave corrected her voice, echoing perfectly through the silent, terrified hall. She slowly ascended the first few steps, her eyes locked on her father. "But it turns out the Alpha King has incredibly high standards. He doesn't eat garbage." Rosalind, clutching her silk wedding skirts, shrank behind Duke Harrington. "Father, what is the meaning of this? Get her out of here. She's ruining my wedding." Desmond let out a low, rumbling growl that actually vibrated the crystal in the chandeliers. Duke Harrington whimpered and took a distinct step away from his new bride. "I am not here to ruin anything, sister." Mave smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I am here on official business. As the Lunar Queen of the Northern Reaches, I have come to collect a long-overdue debt." Mave snapped her fingers. Finnick stepped forward, carrying a heavy leather-bound ledger. He threw it onto the floor at Bartholomew's feet. "You financed Lord Alistair's illegal siege against an independent kingdom," Mave stated, her voice turning hard and authoritative. "A siege that failed spectacularly. According to the king's law, financing an act of unprovoked war against a sovereign territory means the forfeiture of all your assets, lands, and titles to the victor." Bartholomew began to shake his knees, buckling. You cannot do this. I am your father. I gave you life. And you tried to take it away," Mave retorted, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You sent me into the freezing dark with a bomb around my neck. You traded my life for safe passage. Well, father, the toll has gone up." Mave turned to the terrified crowd of nobles. "By the right of conquest and the laws of the realm, the Hastings estate, all its trade routes, and every coin in its vaults now belongs to the Northern Reaches. Bartholomew Hastings is bankrupt." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Duke Harrington, realizing his wealthy new bride was suddenly penniless, looked at Rosalind with undisguised disgust. Bartholomew fell to his knees, weeping. "Please, Mave, I have nothing. What am I to do?" Mave looked down at the pathetic man who had sold her to monsters. She felt no pity, only a profound sense of closure. "I hear the Iron Guild is always looking for manual labor," Mave said, coldly turning her back on him. "I suggest you buy a very warm coat." She walked back down the stairs, slipping her hand seamlessly into Desmond's massive, calloused palm. He looked down at her, a wicked, adoring smirk playing on his scarred face. "Brutal," Desmond murmured as they walked out of the ruined gala, leaving the weeping, ruined merchant behind them. "Remind me never to cross you over a ledger. You couldn't—" Mave laughed softly, leaning against his immense warmth as they stepped out into the cool spring night. "You don't know how to do the math." "I know how to count what matters," he replied, pulling her into his chest and pressing a fierce kiss to the crown of her head. They rode back north, not as a warlord and his captive, but as a king and his queen. Mave Hastings had been thrown to the wolves, expected to die in the snow. Instead, she had returned, leading the pack, proving once and for all that a woman armed with her own brilliant mind is far more dangerous than any beast in the woods. Did Mave's brilliant revenge satisfy your soul as much as it did ours? Don't let this epic tale of betrayal, survival, and fierce werewolf romance end here. If you loved seeing this fierce Luna claim her throne, hit that like button, Share this story with your fellow fantasy romance addicts, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling audio dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done to Bartholomew? See you in the next chapter.